Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Sam here presenting on Christopher Alexander. My friend Yasuhiko has been recommending me Christopher Alexander for a long time, and I've not gotten to it. And, you know, Sam reached out to me. He said he had watched all 37 of our Louis Sullivan videos and was really inspired by them and found them life transforming. And he said, one other person you absolutely need to look at is Christopher Alexander. So I told Sam, okay, you know what? I would love to do that. Why don't you give us an introduction? So that's what this is. Welcome, Sam. So I'm going to leave, I'm handing it over to you. If you could just talk a little bit first about how you encountered Christopher Alexander and what you like about him, and then just dive in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you Shrikant as well for kindly offering to have me on. I came across Christopher Alexander through quite a roundabout way. I think I found a book about like video game design that mentioned his work. He's not that well known. It's strange, his book, A Pattern Language, is one of the most sold out architecture books, but he's still not that well known as a thinker in the architecture sort of community. But I sort of studied his work from how it developed from the outset and went through it chronologically and saw, you know, how his ideas have shaped up throughout his life. And I think he's, you know, a truly profound thinker. And he really changes the way you look at the world.
Wonderful. All right, let's dive in.
So just a couple of facts about his life. He was born in Austria in 1936 to a Jewish mother and a Catholic father. So he had to flee from the Nazis and they emigrated to Britain in 1938. When he was 18, he then studied mathematics at Trinity College at Cambridge University, which is already quite, you know, it's one of the hardest degrees to get into in this country, so it's already quite prodigious. And after he finished that degree, he undertook another degree in architecture, which he finished in 1958. And there was this kind of jarring clash between, there's kind of this assumption with architecture that it's like medical school because it's a lot of years of study, but it's not quite as empirical as a maths degree. So he kind of summarizes this in this quote here. As I took in what I was being taught, I felt that the then prevailing idea of architecture was rootless and arbitrary, mainly governed by styles and pointless quirks of style, and that what architects typically said about it was peculiar, often meaningless and egocentric. In 1958, as early as I could after completing my architecture degree, I left to go to the United States to do a PhD in architecture at Harvard. That was the moment when I first got my feet on the ground and began trying to define the nature of architecture from first principles. So already he kind of has this way of sort of cutting through the gobbledygook and, you know, getting to the core of the matter. So this is what he does. He writes his dissertation, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. It's the first PhD ever awarded in architecture at Harvard. And the question he asks, essentially, how can I design something which is good? And one of the guiding themes for the work is about creating sort of good fit between form and context. So he starts off by talking about unself-conscious cultures and how they tend to have a kind of single form type. And you can see this on the diagram on the right. There's like a directness between the context and the form because the inhabitant shapes the form. And there's kind of this equilibrium where the form self-adjusts and it's perfectly fitted to its context. So, for example, he talks about the Muslim tribe and their mud huts in Cameroon and how they sort of nestle beautifully in the landscape. But that's because they have to survive the erosion of, like, if they were sited poorly, they wouldn't survive the erosion. Or he talks about the Inuit and the igloo and how they can open holes in the igloo or close them with lumps of snow to regulate the internal temperature. And the idea is that, you know, the building maintenance, the constraints of the climate, the patterns of life of the people, they're all fused into this perfect form. And so unselfconscious forms are learned through trial and error. It's like learning to ride a bike. You learn it through imitation of your neighbor and correction of mistakes. But what starts to happen is the architect becomes conscious of their role as an architect, and or the designer, and they start trying to do things to stand out as an individual. And gradually over time, you have architecture forming as a discipline, which is handed down through principles that are more removed from the immediate context. And it's about the kind of conceptual picture of the context and the idea of the forms. And then he concludes by saying that we've reached a point of a kind of loss of innocence now, whereas before architects could kind of stand on the shoulders of their predecessors, and they already had inherited forms that were more adaptive to their context. Now the designer's faced with design problems like, how can I build a skyscraper with millions of different variables that he has to balance out? And sort of the only way he seems to be able to do that is leaning on his position as an artist and his artistic individuality. So, for example, Le Corbusier's plan for Paris, Plan Voisin, he plans these cruciform towers, and the only two guiding principles for them is high density and access to sunlight. So yeah, he summarizes this here in this quote about the kettle. Something as simple as a kettle and all of the different, what he calls misfit variables that you have to address. So it must not be too small, it must not be hard to pick up when it's hot, must be easy to store, to let go of by mistake. And the analogy he uses is a field of hundreds of lights, and each of them are interconnected. So if you turn one light off, so resolve one misfit variable, you might then turn another light on. So for instance, if you were building a house, there might be too little light in the house and you might build more windows, but then that might allow too little privacy. Or you might make other windows bigger, but then that might make the house more susceptible to collapse. But the way he resolves how we can approach this problem is seeing these lights as kind of system of interlinked subsystems that are sufficiently free enough where you can adjust them independently to reach this equilibrium of all of the lights being on at once. And you see this in the diagram with the kettle here, grouping things in terms of production, safety. And we won't go into it due to time, but this is where he brings his mathematical background, and he talks about set theory and categorizing these in terms of sets, which are subsets of other problems. Moving on. So after he completes his PhD, there's a couple of initial work that he gets published. The first is a book called Community and Privacy, which I haven't read, but he writes this with Serge Chemaev, the Russian-born British architect. And I do know that, one of the guiding ideas behind his work that he tries to combat is this autonomy withdrawal syndrome. So how people tend to, especially with the suburban model, withdraw more and more into their homes if they're denied these kind of domains in between that are more public and more private, which you see in the bottom left diagram there. And then another essay which he gets published in 1965 is A City is Not a Tree, which is widely cited. In this essay, he looks at a series of cities that have been planned from the top down, and he contrasts these with cities that have evolved more naturally, like Cambridge, where he studied. So he talks about how in Cambridge you might have a pub with student rooms above it and this mingling of city and university life that forms kind of more of a semi-lattice of all of these variables interacting, rather than comparing it with, say, Messer City, which has it's sort of divided into these different regions, like the university centre, the residential sector, and it embodies more of a kind of tree structure that seems arbitrary and imposed. And all the while he's doing this, he's not just writing academic papers. He's trying to get his hands dirty. So after he finishes writing his PhD, he spends 7 months at, in a village in Gujarat in India called Bavra. And he's tasked with designing a school for the villagers, but he has a very limited budget. So he can't import any materials, so he has to rely on local materials like clay and local techniques like these conical roof tiles that he uses to build the sort of domed vaults and the brick arches. And from this experience, he then co-authors a paper with the famous Indian architect Balkrishna Doshi about how you can kind of create this role for the individual in creating their own environments. Then several years later, he and his colleagues are invited to participate in the Previ competition in Lima, which is for experimental low-cost housing. And already the approach that Alexander and his colleagues take is very different from the other competitors in terms of they spend a few months living with the community and they start to sort of observe the patterns of life of the community living there and then generate the houses based on them. And this creates a split in the jury, so they're deemed as worthy of winning, but they don't actually, they're not actually granted one of the winning entries. But the jury says that, you know, his approach was, they describe it as a freshness of approach, a commitment to the dignity and worth of the individual, a recognition and understanding of the complex linkages between the individual, his family, and his entire community are implicit in each part of this proposal. And this kind of approach he takes a few years later with his project for social housing in Mexicali, in Mexico. And one of the key ideas with this project is the idea of the builder's yard. So they have a block making factory on site, and there's kind of a construction code that they generate that the residents can follow to create their homes as they would like them. And it's very simple, low tech, like vaults made out of lattice strips and burlap and chicken wire, and then plastered over. And they publish a book called The Production of Houses about this process afterwards. But yeah, this is what characterizes Alexander's work as an architect. He's always inventing new ways of making. So really this studying community sort of patterns of life, this gives him the inspiration to publish his most sold book, A Pattern Language. I think it's one of the most sold books about architecture ever. And he co-authors this with his colleagues at the Center for Environmental Structure, which he sets up whilst he's a professor at University of California in Berkeley. And I guess what you could call it, this sort of, the first of this sort of trilogy of books is the Oregon Experiment. So what happens is the students from the University of Oregon invite him to come up with a master plan for the future of the campus. You know, around the time the students were protesting a lot of things like the Vietnam War draft and, you know, the brutalist buildings that were being built that they felt were quite aesthetically polarizing. So Alexander and his colleagues come up with this master plan for piecemeal growth of the university, which follows these sort of patterns of design that will ensure that the design's good. So yeah, what are these patterns? There's 253 of them that he writes about in a pattern language. They cover everything from towns, buildings to, you know, the level of construction. And the idea is that each pattern basically has a context or a problem, a system of forces that define that problem, and then there's a solution or a configuration that they come up with. So the example I've included here of the bus stop, you know, how do we create a bus stop that is enjoyable to use and people like? And they discuss the problem and talk, you know, it goes back to his idea of the what's it? The cities. A city is not a tree. And how all of these things are interlinked. How you can create new stands linked with the bus stop and like create life there. And this book actually proves to be a major inspiration to Ward Cunningham, the creator of Wiki Web, the first wiki, especially the idea of these kind of hyperlinks. So at the start of each pattern, there's the patterns before it that it's related to, and then at the end there's patterns which you can incorporate to then you can incorporate into your designs. The idea is you come up with a sort of language of patterns for your projects that you can follow by picking them out. And the final book of this trilogy is The Timeless Way of Building. So this really provides the philosophical background for the work. It's quite sort of wishy-washy, but it's also very like poetic to read. And Alexander, this is basically Alexander's Tao of architecture. So how can, he says, how can we make places that are alive? We have to follow the timeless way of building. And he says, how do we do this? Well, this is defined by the quality without a name. So yeah, this is just an extract from that book where he says, the search which we make for this quality in our lives is the central search of any person and the crux of any individual person's story. It is the search for those moments and situations when we are most alive. In order to define this quality in buildings and towns, we must begin by understanding that every place is given its character by certain patterns of events that keep on happening there, i.e. its pattern language. So off the back of writing a pattern language, it's quite successful and it gets them a lot of commissions. And the building that he's most famous for is the Aishin campus, which is a school just outside Tokyo that's built in 1985. And they very much follow the approach they set out in a pattern language. So they interview students and teachers about what they would envision their dream school as being like, as silly as that may sound. And so one of the patterns they come up with for the project is the idea of this home-based street, which you see in the top middle image, which is where the students circulate between lessons, and it's this quite intimate internal street, and it really provides the spine for the whole project. And this street leads up to the central hall, which is this assembly space that they created with, you can see window seats on the side and this like magnificent horseshoe arch truss, which was like designed to create a sort of grand space, but also quite intimate as well. And they used glue laminated timber, which was quite rare at the time and quite expensive. But it led, this leads quite well into their next project, the Julian Street Inn, which was a homeless shelter in San Jose. And they wanted to carry this forward into the dining room for the homeless shelter. So to create this kind of intimate sheltering roof form, they realized that they wouldn't be able to do it in glulam because it'd be quite expensive. So the engineer that Christopher Alexander worked with, Gary Black, came up with this idea of casting the roof trusses in concrete in situ. And they kind of developed this form in an iterative process using an early version of finite element analysis, the engineering software program, to sort of iterate the form and come up with the best form that they could. And the last project I've included is the Westdean Visitor Centre, which they worked on with what used to be King Charles's Institute of Architecture, students from there. And again, it's kind of inventing these new ways of making things that are in keeping with the local vernacular, so brick and flint. And this is when he starts to explore like some of his ideas in the nature of order about centers and alternating repetition, but we'll get onto that. So yeah, this is Alexander's magnum opus, The Nature of Order. It's 4 volumes. The Phenomenon of Life, Process of Creating Life, A Vision of a Living World, and The Luminous Ground. So what Alexander finds is, after he's published a pattern language, there's people trying to copy the patterns, but they're creating these buildings that are kind of a mishmash of patterns and ideas, and there's not really this wholeness to them. And so as early as like 1968, he's trying to work out how it is that we can perceive this wholeness in space. So he conducts an experiment at the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies, where he presents a group of undergraduate students with 35 strips comprised of differently positioned black and white squares. And he asked the students to rank these strips according to their ease of recognition and memorization. So what happens is some of the students rank the strips sequentially, so where the order in which the black squares appear, but the other way some of the students organize the strips is according to their overall gestalt. And he realizes that the strips that are the most memorable seem to have the most local symmetries, which he illustrates in this diagram on the top left. Many years later, he then writes a book called A Foreshadowing of 21st Century Art, the color and geometry of very early Turkish carpets. So throughout his life, Alexander collected some of the finest early Turkish rugs, like outside of the Istanbul museums. And he studied them very closely to see how he could create the life that these carpets seem to have. What he calls their kind of geometry of wholeness. And this is where he kind of develops the idea of centers. So these kind of hierarchical sort of life coming out of the centers from the way they overlap, and there's sort of different hierarchical degrees of wholeness based on these centers. And whilst he's doing this, he's also studying nature and processes in nature, and this gives him the idea for the nature of order. So for example, he looks at how the embryonic mouse limb develops, and what he finds is it's not just the genetic code or DNA of the mouse limb, it's also the mouse limb developing according to the geometry of the previous configuration. And so, this kind of forms the basis of his approach for the nature of order, sort of contrasting human artifacts like Matisse's paintings, Shaker furniture, with like natural processes like sediment plumes in the Mississippi or how stalactites form, things like that. And he comes to identify 15 fundamental properties. And these are really the first principles which he was searching from the very start. So you can see 5 of these first principles in the image of the milk drop on the right, which he describes at length of how it generates these kind of levels of scale and alternating repetition, local symmetries, etc. And he also looks at how it is these fundamental properties like manifest in the great works of architecture and art and in nature. And he finds that they sort of unfold. So he looks at St. Mark's and how St. Mark's Square in Venice, the very famous basilica, and how it develops over time, and how each sort of addition to the whole builds on the previous whole, and that creates this, one of the greatest spaces in the world. So yeah, a lot of his work is sort of looking at studies done by emergent scientists, but it's slightly different in that he doesn't see it as just being a 2-level relationship in nature where things are just interacting and then something comes out of it. He sees there being a third factor, which is harmony, which governs how these things develop. So I think this is the final work he publishes, Harmony Seeking Computations, where he talks about this at length. And this really forms the basis of his last book, The Luminous Ground, where he talks about the implications of sort of how conceiving of space as being comprised of these centers, which are governed by these 15 fundamental properties, kind of changes the way we see the world and the metaphysical implications that it has. But, you know, they're really, I'd recommend just trying to get a copy of some of the books if you can, to because he substantiates them much better than I have here, probably. And yeah, that's where I'll leave this presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam, for giving us an introduction to this. You know, this great mind. Let's do one thing. If you could stop sharing.
Yep.
So what I want to do first is to, you know, the person who recommended Christopher Alexander to me for the first time, yes, Yasuhiko happens to be here. So I want to ask Yasuhiko about his thoughts about Christopher Alexander and what Christopher Alexander brings to the table. Yasuhiko, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Very informative presentation. I am not an architect, I'm a philosopher. And for, let's see, from 2006, shortly after you were born, to 2013-14, I used to do an extensive and intensive course in philosophy. And one of the main themes of my program was beauty and wholeness. And I could not find anything better than Christopher Alexander's, nature of order. Although I like timeless way of building, it's like Lao Tzu's 20th century Lao Tzu Tao Te Ching. But at the same time, the nature of order is very comprehensive. And of course, my most favorite is fourth volume, Luminous Ground. And that was the required reading. And I suggested everybody to read everything before they get to the fourth volume. So what struck me, beside his brilliant creative ideas, living in modern cities. Let's go back. At the time, so he was born 1935 or 6, around that time. So it was the war between World War I and II, and the whole world is going into World War II. A lot of death took place. And then post-World War II, all those city lives and city itself became less alive. And to me, his work has this almost like a mission to make alive human life through the buildings in wherever it is they are built. And so if I have to go to a remote island with only one book, I'll bring four volumes of Nature Order. And beyond architecture, I think it is very important for people to really kind of understand and understand how he perceives the universe, how he perceives life, and beginning to really. So we live in whatever the house built, but my wife and I try to trace things in such a way that the space has the most life. And that way of thinking is so important. And I'm attending this. One of the major question I have, maybe for you and for Shrikant, is I don't know much about Louis Sullivan. I'm very curious as to the similarities, the principles that they both share, and where they differ. And that's more like a question. But the value of his work is so significant for today's world. And somebody who interviewed him said 500 years from now, most of us will be completely forgotten, but he will be remembered. And I agree with that. One of the greatest works ever produced by our contemporary. By the way, in 2007, when I was going to England, I contacted Dr. Alexander, and either his daughter or wife responded to me, and we were going to meet. But shortly before I left the United States, I received the email that he was ill. So I missed an opportunity to meet him. But anyway, that's my personal recollection.
Wonderful.
I'll say more, but at this moment, that is, my soulful connection to this man.
Wow. So Yasuhiko, this is actually, this question is the most important question of the connection between Alexander and Louis Sullivan for 52 Living Ideas, because we've spent a lot of time on Louis Sullivan. And for me personally, I've lived with Louis Sullivan for his ideas for, 2 or 3 decades. And I just love it, dearly. And it's kind of part of me.
Yes.
And from everything that you have said about, you always said about Christopher Alexander, right from the time that you recommended him for the first time, I've known that, look, there is something here, okay, something very large here. And as you know, these great thinkers, the only way they can produce this level of work is to be a philosopher, and you have to have a genuinely authentic view of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, design, beauty. They have to be everything, really, in order to do what they do. And so this is really a unique opportunity. Now, so what I want to do is I want to do a 3-way conversation here between you, me, and Sam. Now, Sam has an advantage. Sam has an advantage over both of us because he's the only one who knows some about both of these people, okay? So he has an unfair advantage. So please make full use of it, okay, Sam? But what I'm going to do is, so let's have this 3-way communication, because that will also set the ground about why we should study it. Because look, I mean, just like, when we're studying Tao Te Ching or Gita or Louis Sullivan, you either dive into it to understand the depth of it. Just skimming over it and saying that, okay, look, I have read this, doesn't do anything. So, but in order to do that, it's important to connect it to everything else. So let's have a 3-way communication. So we've talked a little bit about Christopher Alexander. So let me talk a little bit about Louis Sullivan. And then I will request Sam to comment on both of them. And then we will go, and then Yasuhiko, you can ask further questions. You can comment more about Christopher Alexander and the connection. So what we're trying to do is that we're trying to explore the relationship between these two giants and their way of thinking, okay? So let me give a quick introduction, because not all of everybody here will be familiar with Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan, I'm just going to focus on his ideas, because now let's keep aside the particular lives and let's compare ideas of these two people. The core idea of Louis Sullivan is form ever follows function. He has a very deep idea. The best way to describe it is this. In his book called a system of architectural ornament, which we are going to launch in September, by the way. It's going to be our best series on Louis Sullivan, because my friend Sherry, who kind of quarterbacks the series, she's actually traveling to London. She has not disclosed. She said, it's a mystery why I'm traveling to London, but I'm going to travel to London in order to research something on this particular thing, to follow something. But the simplest way of thinking about Louis Sullivan's ideas is what he calls the seed germ. He says, always remember the seed germ. This germ over here, this is like these two are cotyledons. These have the basic living material, but it is the seed germ over here in the middle that takes all of that in order to grow into something. So keep your attention focused on the function, and then see how surroundings are taken in to produce something which is appropriate for that place. So his dictum is always, keep focused on the seed germ, or keep focused on the functions. And then forms should follow the function. Create forms. You need to create forms. That's the nature of human beings. We live by reworking our environment, transforming our environment to be in accordance with the function. You can talk about it as spirit and matter. It's the spiritual. You want the matter to be spirituated. You want spiritual matter. You want the forms to be functionated. What Yasuhiko was talking about, when you're living in a place, you set up a place which is conducive to living, because we actually interact with everything. We are, a very deep notion here is that of conversation. All our products talk to us, and you talk to the product just like you talk to people. And there has to be life in all of it. It has to be in accordance with your soul. It has to be in accordance with the soul of other people. And it has to be in accordance with how these souls interact with one another. And how do you build a material world that provides the context for that to happen right here on earth? So this is all about bringing heaven on earth. Okay, that's what the goal is of Louis Sullivan and Christopher Alexander. So that's a very brief take on Louis Sullivan. So now I'm going to throw it to Sam. Sam, you said that you found Louis Sullivan very interesting. Talk a little bit about Louis Sullivan, and then if you want, you can talk a little bit about the comparison. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm actually quite jealous of you, Shrikant, because I think going from Sullivan to Alexander, it just enriches it so much more. I think one of the things people get wrong about Sullivan is its form ever follows function. I think there was a kind of concept creep where, it was seen as this kind of idea of the house as a machine for living in, the form following the function. But you mentioning his system of architectural ornament, it's so close to Alexander. The way he talks about the sort of life coming out of the Pentagon through this unfolding process of, it's very similar with the kind of seed germ, because a lot of what Alexander's saying is, if we want to create life, we can't have this blueprint approach to design where it's kind of top down. It has to start from the bottom up, and we have to make decisions based on the actual context and like trying to inculcate as much wholeness there as possible. And the other aspect I think that's quite similar between them is this kind of fusing of like man's spiritual aspects and also the more objective aspects of man. So Alexander has this background in mathematics, and he starts by trying to approach design problems from a really logical perspective, but he realizes more and more that he has to bring feeling into the equation. And what else was I going to say?
That's okay. Let me comment on this one particular point, because we are kind of going back and forth. I want to, kind of relate ideas of both these people. So when, there is a beautiful paper very short paper by Sullivan called Tall Building Artistically Reconsidered. Okay? It's about design of skyscraper. And that's the best formulation I've seen about the connection between the objective and subjective. He starts out by saying, look, and he's considered to be the father of the skyscraper, because before him, people were trying to design skyscrapers like they had designed all of the buildings. He comes and says, look, this is a new phenomena. With the steel and elevators, the problem of city living now has a different solution. Okay, it's a completely different context, and you need to design for that. So he starts out by saying, look, what is the objective situation? The objective situation is that many people want to be in the same place so that they can trade with each other. Okay, that's what a city is. And now for the first time, we have a way where we can do so by building things up. In the same place, you can have many people. That is the fundamental problem. Then he looks at objectively what the ground floor is like, what the second floor is like, what are the potentials of it. And then says, look, everything else really doesn't distinguish itself. And then this needs to be on the top. So he does kind of the full objective design. And then just a most amazing statement, he says, but you have to remember, tall building needs to look tall. Tall building must look tall. So it needs to have the emotional quality of loftiness, of this soaring lines, where anybody who sees it gets that, because that is actually the meaning of it. That's what is being made possible objectively. So the subjective feeling of a person using the building has to be concomitant of the grandeur of the objective thing. The ground floors, they are making the retail trade possible. That is something that is profound. People want something and some people are providing it. Create a space. Like you can see the Carson Peary Scott. I was there just couple weeks ago. Just brilliant. It's like you feel as if you're saying, I want to be here. I want to be here. So he always calculates all the objective things first, and then puts the architecture, the beauty in them. Now, because it is thought out objectively, it has a beauty of its own. But in addition to that, he adds things that will speak to your emotions, integrates it into that so that it becomes one whole. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, I was just thinking then, I think there's similarities between their backgrounds as well. Like Louis Sullivan, he was educated at the Beaux-Arts Academy in France. And at the time, like there was this issue of, every capital having its St. Peter's, people more and more leaning on sort of classical details and just building things exactly as they were in antiquity, rather than like, how can we create forms ourselves? And this is the problem both Louis Sullivan and Alexander are trying to get at. I'd say Sullivan is he has that kind of integrative grasp where he can sort of manage all of these problems. And he's also very in touch with, Alexander does this thing called the mirror of the self test, where he, similar to that test with the strips, where he found the local symmetries, he presents two objects to people and he says to them, which is a better reflection of yourself and your life, your hopes, your struggles, your dreams. Like tries to kind of get them into this flow of thinking about things deeply in the wholeness within them, reflected in the object. And he actually finds that he gets like 90% agreement on loads of different objects, most of the time. And this is kind of Sullivan's idea of the image is a product of the man who created it. It's about, you know, striving for simplicity and letting it kind of unfold from this seed germ, as you were saying.
Wonderful. I want to add one more thing. See, what happens is that when you're looking at people, you know, these great people, you kind of have to understand how their mind works. Yes. And each of them is different. Each of them is different. Like Louis Sullivan is an artist. Mm-hmm. He's a prophet. He's a deeply spiritual person, though he will not speak of it as a spiritual thing, but that deep artistic expression just flows through all his words, all his buildings, and it is unmistakable. It just hits you. It's like I can read something and say, oh, that's just Sullivan. You look at something, oh, that's just has to be Sullivan. So he's a deep, deep artist. So there is kind of psychoepistemological differences between people. Yasuhiko, go ahead.
So, you know, we are all here to create heaven on earth. Although some people seems to be trying to create the hell on earth. And through my work as a philosopher and architecture, we are here to somehow bring something of the heaven, the spiritual dimension to this world. And Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world. And that statement was the theme of Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Prize winning lecture. And that's, to me, so essential. To me, my life is a project beauty. But anyway, so in the intellectual climate of the 20th century and into 21st century, we are rediscovering wholeness as opposed to totality. You know, epistemologically and ontologically, wholeness is primary to parts. So quality without name, Tao, which is very close to function, which has no boundary, which arises in the interrelations that constitute the wholeness. So it is like a fractal of wholeness, the function. So there's a similarity there. And I think both, based on my understanding, Christopher Alexander definitely, and maybe Louis Sullivan too, that's, you know, in the process of creating heaven on earth, they are bringing this mode of awareness, of bringing wholeness as such into their own creation. And that's the significance to me, you know. And let's see, so mathematics, as we know, in 1935, around the time that actually he was born, 25 actually, you know, the Kurt Gödel came up with this two incompleteness theorems. And there are many ways of interpreting this. But you see, mathematics as is not the totality assemblage. It is also wholeness, which produces a theorems that cannot be logically proven to be true or untrue, but intuitively in your holistic intelligence. If you're a mathematician, the mathematician's holistic intelligence, he or she knows it is true or untrue, unprovable logically. is again quality without name. It is something that cannot be logically deduced, yet you know. And so it seems to me both of those great architects seems to be bringing that way of knowing, that way of creating into this, this world in their effort to create heaven on earth.
Wonderful, beautiful. I want to make two more points here. One is the view that they have of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And it is truly exalted. It's like what they think a human being is. So they're not just saying that I am that, but they're saying human beings are that. Mm-hmm. And they're designing for that. Mm-hmm. A very deep empathy mm-hmm. for human beings and this exalted view. And they are building with that in mind. So that's one part, just the view of man. Because in some ways, modern world, like the view of man is, okay, you're just using this. What else do you want? You just use this and you're good. No, and part of that is like, Louis Sullivan, the system of architectural ornaments and elsewhere, he talks about man's powers. So he systematically says, who is man? Mm-hmm. So he says, we have the physical capacity, we have the mental capacity, we have the emotional capacity, we have the spiritual capacity. Anything you design has to speak to all of them. Mm-hmm. And in an integrated fashion. Mm-hmm. If you don't do that, you're not designing for man. What are you doing? You're not designing at all for man. We're trying to design here, So that's one part. The second part is that in some ways, these people are anachronistic. They are bringing an idea which is very old, which I find very much alive in Tao Te Ching or Gita or the Bible, of importance of spirit. And regarding that, not as an afterthought, but as being the core thing. It's like, if you don't have that, you don't have anything. And that's the same point about wholeness, of that man is an integrated being of spirit, emotions, thoughts, actions. We are an integrated being of individual and society, others and us. It is not others versus us. It is this and that together. And both of these folks are thinking that, and that is very similar to what we see, a sage in Tao Te Ching do, or a person in Gita do, or Jesus talk about. It's the same idea. Go ahead, Yasuhiko.
I don't know about Louis Sullivan, but one of the concepts that I really was impressed by Christopher Alexander is this: boundaries enhances wholeness. And that was, to me, a revelation to me. And then around that time, I also went to Brazil, and I went to this rainforest. There's enormous biodiversity. And it's somehow that richness of biodiversity increases the experience of the wholeness, of a unity of this rainforest. And function has no boundary. Form has boundary. Actually, so there is an interaction here. By creating form in such a way, it actually highlights the function even more.
Beautiful. Yes? Beautiful.
Can I quickly jump in, Shrika?
Please, Sam, feel free to jump in anytime you want. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just interesting you mentioning Kurt Gödel. In Notes to the Synthesis of Form, he's drawing on George Cantor's set theory. And I was thinking about, I'll probably butcher the explanation of this, but Cantor's diagonal argument where he comes up with these actual infinities, where you can always come up with a set of infinite numbers that's different to mine.
Mhm.
And I think Alexander finds this with some of his colleagues as well. They start to come up with these algorithmic procedures for measuring life.
Mhm.
So very like rudimentary, but like they look at some of the most beloved buildings like the Taj Mahal and like rank them on a scale according to their like
Mhm.
curvature of lines, changes in color hue. But there's this sense that any kind of aesthetic decision making will always be like powerfully foregrounded by the subjective person, because that is where the life comes from, if that makes sense.
Excellent point. So a couple of things. So firstly, one thing that I see that, as we're seeing similarities, I also want to start seeing differences as well. So one of the things that I see Christopher Alexander doing is to actually travel the world and talk to different groups of people, not just talk, but actually work with them and design something for them. Now, of course, it is a lot more easier to do that in the 20th century than 19th century. That's one thing, but that is very, very, very important because he's able to kind of induce from the architectural design experience of many cultures. He's able to go to different places. So that's, I think, one thing that distinguishes him in some way. The second point, I wanted to respond to what Yasuhiko was saying. One of the things that I see in Louis Sullivan, and I'm pretty sure it's true of Christopher Alexander, but that I don't know, but so I'll stick to Louis Sullivan. Yasuhiko, you mentioned going to the rainforest. Okay, that's what I see Sullivan doing. Okay, basically going to nature, keeping on going to nature continuously for inspiration, for ideas, for standards. It's like, if nature can do this, I'm nature too.
Yeah.
And I have to be able to do at least that, if not better. Okay, and it's kind of continuously drawing the inspiration from nature. Unfortunately, modern people, they just look at forms around them, which are forms that are dead forms, with no function, and they regard that as their natural default setting. So they are kind of limited by the boxes that are around them, and then all their thinking becomes boxes. You say, okay, now how do I fit everything into boxes? And they try to. So it's the classic way of saying form and then function. Because these are boxes, I will live like a box, live like an object, and lose the spirit that I see in nature, that is there in nature, that is there in me. So kind of return to nature, I think, is a very big thing.
Yes. And we can create a culture that enhances nature instead of a form of destruction. And the way of thinking that Christopher Alexander employs, that is exactly the way of thinking through which we can enhance nature through our culture.
Yeah, I mean, Sullivan mentions like the infinite great spirit, doesn't he? And it's Alexander's also trying to search for that through nature. And I think they're also very similar in terms of,
yes,
like you were saying, Shrikant, they're very democratic. They're always seeking, how can we involve like the lowest common denominator in creating their own environment, or
Yes, Sullivan has written extensively. There is a book called Democracy, A Man's Search. He's talked a lot about social, because what he's saying is that, this hierarchy that we have is artificial, of all kinds of hierarchies, where, you're losing the original idea that each individual is where it's the prime mover. And that is how you design everything, not just architecture, even like how you associate with other people. So he has, deep ideas coming from that.
Yes.
Next topic I want to look at, which is also big commonality, is that of universal ideas. In Louis Sullivan's autobiography, there is one instance of this teacher from France saying, no exceptions. It's like, if you have an idea which has exceptions, no, don't do, that's not. And then Louis Sullivan puts it very beautifully in his own way. He says, I have learned that it's only the universal ideas that matter, that only by focusing on those few universal ideas. And because they're universal, they're like a seed, like the seed of everything, really, from which everything can come. But all you have to pay attention is to that seed. The standard for what constitutes a good seed are very high because it has to be universal. And so his entire focus is on discovering and using universal ideas. And
so give us some examples of those ideas that he came up with.
Form ever follows function.
Yes, yes.
The second one, which is not as well known, but which is also very profound, is every problem contains its own solution.
Yeah.
So by seeing the limits of the problem, the point that you're making about limits, in the process of saying what the problem is, because what he's saying is that most people actually regard, when they think of problem, it's just that they feel a certain way, negative about it. All they have is feeling. They have never really asked the question, what is it? By relentlessly asking the question, what is it? What should be done with it shows up. So if you get what is it, then so metaphysics and epistemology are connected. That if you get the nature of things right, what it does should come from that. Go ahead.
Yeah, when you fully understand the problem, there you find the answer.
Yes.
Truly, yeah.
So could you talk a little bit, Yasuhiko or Sam, a little bit about the universal principles in Alexander? How he thinks about it, Sam?
Do you want to go, Yasuhiko?
Please.
Go ahead.
You're the expert.
No. I mean, I was just thinking then, it's like in kindergarten chats when Louis Sullivan almost has to tell a student to calm down because he starts to see the kind of mockery of buildings.
See, Yasuhiko, Sam has advantage over both of us because he knows both. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, well, after you finished reading Chris Alexander, it's like you don't see space as value neutral. It's kind of laden with value because of these universal ideas. And it actually is quite enraging, which is why the last book he published was The Battle for the Life and Beauty of Earth, which was all about his experience of at the Aishin school trying to get it built. And he talks about two types of systems in construction. The system he follows, which is, they would literally just stand in the field and lay out stakes and work out where the positions of buildings would go. And they were trying to get the construction to evolve naturally, so never making a decision before it had to be made, so that there was no arbitrary decisions made, basically. And just through going through the process of this, there's talks about them bribing the contractors that they're working with. The head teacher of the school gets beaten up by thugs. It's just honestly crazy to read, but that is the core of Alexander's life. It's this unrelenting compromise to do what is good.
From what I have learned, let's see, the universal ideas. So the one I just mentioned, boundaries enhances wholeness. So when you do this, you need to have the awareness of wholeness and the form at the same time, so that there's an interaction between function and form. And that's how you actually enhance the wholeness, yes. And that's number one. Let's see. Another one. I was thinking when someone was talking, I had a few ideas about universal ideas. Let's see. Second one is equivalence of wholeness, beauty, aliveness, and the presence of self. Those are the almost like a same phenomenon, use different words: beauty, wholeness, presence of self, or alignment of yourself and the self of the universe, the same thing. Those are the equivalent.
Wow.
Not exactly the same, but it is a same thing spoken in different way. And at the core of all this, there's a quality without name. And any space that is alive, there is this quality without name is present. He really sounds like Lao Tzu.
Wow.
Because Tao cannot be spoken about, and that quality cannot be spoken about. But amazing that somebody, of that academic background places this at the center of his, thinking. That's amazing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that is, I think, universal idea is very important ideas. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now I want to give a chance for people to ask questions. Okay, because I'm getting more and more convinced we really need to go through, dive into Christopher Alexander. Let me ask one question to both Yasuhiko and Sam, and then if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. So the question I have is, if somebody wants to start out with Christopher Alexander, where would you start? Yasuhiko first and then Sam.
Okay. The kind of people who come to me to study philosophy, I will start with a timeless way of being.
Mm-hmm.
And then go into nature of order. And if they become more technically interested, go into a pattern language. That's those are the only books I have read anyway. So he may have written many other things, which some knows, yeah. So based on the books I have read, that will be the order. Although I have read the Luminous Ground first, personally, but that may not be the right order.
Right. No, thank you. Sam, if somebody was just starting out with Christopher Alexander, what would you recommend? Where do they start?
Well, it definitely depends on your background.
Yeah.
I think if you're an architect, if you start with, go through chronologically. If you just want to taste it, start with A City Is Not a Tree. It's a very short essay. Notes on the Synthesis of Form, I think.
No, let's keep architecture aside, because most of us here are not architects. We want somebody, we want to kind of, the idea of 52 Living Ideas is to take and make the ideas accessible to everybody. So take people at large. So what would you recommend?
I think, the timeless way of building, but I think you have to, the thing about Alexander is that you have to read how he got there. You can't, I think if you dive into the Luminous Ground, unless you're already more amenable to some of the ideas in it, it won't have the same profound impact on you, because you'll be jumping between all of the first three books is just him laying out this whole cosmology, and then the final book is okay, this is where you're taking us.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Yes.
The people who have taken my course, maybe they got a book list of 50, 60 books in 3 years. No, I don't expect everybody to read everything. But, people who read the most, they all say Nature of Order was the best book book that they have read.
Okay,
All the books I recommended.
perfect. This is beautiful. So looks like that is his masterpiece.
Yeah, no question about it.
And I think the good thing is that I also think from everything I've heard, Timeless Way of Building is a good place to start because we are very, very familiar with the Tao. We've done 100 meetups on Tao Te Ching.
That's Tao Te Ching, truly.
Yeah, exactly. So that probably is going to be the easiest way into Christopher Alexander for this group. All right. So let's go for questions, folks. Questions, and let's keep it to just questions so we can get as many questions answered as possible. We'll start with Joe, followed by Mike, followed by DLJ. Joe.
Thanks, guys, for this presentation. This has been really, really special. So one thing that was mentioned by Samuel was the idea of the geometry of wholeness. And I was wondering if you could actually expand upon that. And I don't know, maybe even possibly, Yasuhiko, you might be able to compare and contrast him to Buckminster Fuller, who is also has a geometry of thought. There's, I mean, if possible, but there's that struck me. And then I have some follow-ups that later on I can ask.
Thank you, Joe. Great question. Sam, go ahead.
Well, I think looking at Louis Sullivan's system of architectural ornament will be great for explaining this, but it's him like looking at these Turkish rugs. He's looking at how sort of a lot of these rugs were created by people interested in Sufism. So it's like how these geometries interlock and overlap, and the symmetries, the local symmetries between them. And they start from like a simple star, and the shit gets more and more complex. And it's the complete antithesis of, you know, it's like you'll see it in maybe like a Frank Lloyd Wright plan, like the plan has like got loads of detail that's grown up out of it, but it's the opposite of like just the simple concept design of like, let's build the shard or let's build. It's about like creating at every scale, different levels of detail, which fit into a larger whole.
Thank you, Sam. Yasuhiko, would you like to add anything?
Okay. Comparing him and Alexander and Buckminster Fuller. Well, Synergetics has a subtitle called Geometry of Thinking. And whose thinking is it? Is it humans or God's thinking? It's a very interesting question. But anyway, you see, all we are dealing with in the most fundamental sense is the logos of St. John's. In the beginning and always and forever until the end, there is logos. And we are finding millions of ways of talking about logos. And from my perspective, so Buckminster Fuller really identified and developed this geometry of thinking, which can be applied to architecture, of course, and many other things. And to me, Christopher Alexander's way of thinking is more pre-geometrical. And depending on where he's building his buildings, he creates living geometry in the form of architecture. So there's a thinking there. It's like a primordial thinking, geometrical thinking is there, with the quality without name at the center and sense of awareness at the center. And the pre-geometrical thinking or supra-geometrical thinking is always applying. And geometry is actually living structure that he actually created. So depending on the landscape, he will create something. I don't know if he has actually identified a universal grammar for this, but definitely each building is a living geometry. So that is my sense of it. You know, I don't know. I don't think he has created something like synergetics where the universally, you know, formulated geometry is present. But you get the sense of his way of thinking. You get geometrizing. That is my experience. I don't know. Some is more.
Let's keep going. Let's
Yeah.
get as many people in as possible. But I cannot resist to tell you this, Yasuhiko, because this is a new thing that I thought of the last month or so. You know, you said it's all about logos.
Yeah.
And I want to connect it to the concept of seed. You know, when you think of, you know, kind of metaphors for logos, seed is a really amazingly powerful metaphor. You know, it's all things were made through him. Mm-hmm. So it's the seed of everything. Mm-hmm. And when you actually focus on the seed, right? Mm-hmm. When you focus on logos, it transforms you. Mm-hmm. You know, you become it. You know, you create life through it. Mm-hmm. You're taking that universal principle and you are creating life through it. So it's like growing a tree within yourself. So whatever you were there as the old man, the cross is that cotyledons.
Yes.
Whatever you bring to it. And the one in the middle is the new seed that you take in at every point of time. Yeah. So it allows you growth and rebirth at every point of time. Yes. And then and it is different every time because the world is different. You are different. Your surrounding is different. So what it produces is different, but it is based on the same seed. Yes. Thank you. Mike, what's your question? Mike, go ahead.
Okay, we've mentioned a lot of names here besides Alexander. Buckminster Fuller and Louis Sullivan, but also Gödel and Cantor and a few others. I think the commonality, and this is kind of a question underneath all this. The commonality is that language shapes our understanding of reality. And reality shapes our understanding of language too. And we've taught what we're dealing here with is, and the question is one that a form follows function, or maybe it's function follows form. But in relation to what you've been talking about, language follows thought, and thought follows the environment, or maybe it's the environment follows thought, which then follows language, which allows a number of people to build it.
Thank you. Mike, let me go ahead and put it as a question. Give me just a second. So question, Yasuhiko, if you want to answer that, where does language fit in all of this? What is the role of language?
That's a huge question.
Yes. Yes.
Well, the language is an aspect of logos. Yes?
Yes.
And, well, wow. How?
Okay, let me do one thing.
I can put this.
No. Let me go ahead and say something. Let me go ahead and say.
It is a lot of thought coming right there.
Yes. I'll tell you the most interesting thing that I've looked at yesterday. I was looking back at Owen Barfield. He has one of the, apart from Julian Jaynes. Julian Jaynes is the best on this. Second, I find Owen Barfield. He had one observation. I did this, this is only the third day after I had discovered Owen Barfield, and I was trying to summarize everything he was saying from all the books that I had read in the last 3 days. And I said it was just one sentence. He says, language can produce a felt transformation of consciousness. What he's saying.
One aspect of it, no question about that.
Yeah, so it is like, it's a huge deal. Like, you know, language can really, I mean, that's what logos is, you know. You take in the logos, you take in the principle, and you focus on it, and that focus, it's like it's allowing you to focus on the Tao. It is a way, it is the way, it is the means of focusing on the Tao, and all of it is contained in it. And so that's what language can do at its highest, at its highest. Anyway, so thank you. Yasuhiko, if you want to say something.
No, that's beautiful. Yes, yes. Because you wanna go into this is a
yes.
You can have maybe one series on language only.
Absolutely. That's all right, folks. So please go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you have more questions. Next up is DLJ. DLJ.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. My sound okay?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so I've got a question for Samuel. Do you prefer Sam or Samuel?
Sam, please. Yeah, I don't mind. But
That wasn't the question, but I'll go with Sam. Right. I read the Wikipedia entry on your friend before the meetup, just to get a flavor, because I hadn't heard of him before, I confess. And I didn't get a there was a connection with my mum, because my mum was born a year younger, moved from Austria for the same reason a year before, and then also died a year before he did. So I thought, oh, okay. So I read further. But I personally didn't get a connection, maybe because architecture maybe isn't my thing. So I'm curious, what is it for you, right? So what was your personal journey of discovery? What inspired you to go deeper, and not into architecture per se, but this particular architect? So what's the fascination is what I'm after. Personal question, which you don't have to answer, but I'm curious.
Well, I'd say reading Alexander, it makes you feel like a bit like it's you versus the world, especially going through university, because Alexander is he just cuts through a lot of the bullshit. It's like, how can we make things which are good objectively? There's no kind of, oh, I need to, like, I'd recommend reading there's this famous 1982 debate that he has with the architect Peter Eisenman, and Peter Eisenman is saying, oh, well, I just think what you're doing is like quiche, and you know, it's not avant-garde. And he's talking about some of his buildings that are trying to like represent the sense of 20th century anxiety. And Alexander, in contrast to that, is just saying, if I'm going to build a table, I'm going to build the best table I can using the means that are available to me. I'm not going to try and bring some other idea that's not relevant to create this work of art. And it's this kind of, he's focusing on this kind of disconnection from like the wholeness that we have compared to, as modern people, compared to more ancient cultures, and how we can then inculcate that again.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. And, you know, I find this in both their careers, you know, Louis Sullivan for sure, because what happens is that most people are just focused on the effects. They are just focused on what is around them. And they are actually, all they're trying to do is to imitate other people. That's all they're trying to do. It's all about imitation. There's somebody like Louis Sullivan or Christopher Alexander is going back to the first principles, and they're going to say, why are we doing this? Who am I? What is society? And as a result, they clash against a lot of things. And that's part of it. You know, you're beginning your career. So it's you know, to incorporate these ideas is going to be challenging. And I'm just giving you a heads up. But let's go with, I think Rich had a wonderful question. Sam, could you read that in the chat and answer it if you can? And then if Yasuhiko wants to answer it, he can do so as well. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. Is there one concept proposed by Alexander which you believe, if taken on by both architect and wider society, it would undoubtedly transform society for the better, and why? Yeah, it's a very good question. I think just the unfolding process. I think his idea of, you know, trying to sustain, and like you mentioned, Shrikant, it's very difficult to achieve in the kind of system that we have, but trying to achieve changes to the design step by step. So you never make a decision before you have to, and none of your decisions are contrived because you're always reacting to the actual feedback of the environment that you're in, rather than trying to impose something arbitrarily. So and you can take this approach to things in life generally, like rather than freaking out about, oh, I need to, how you're going to plan to do a piece of work. If you start with the smallest possible step and then you build up from that, you gradually form a picture of the whole.
Wonderful. Yasuhiko, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I don't remember which volume, but there is a concept he developed called structure preserving transformation. And we talk about transformation, but he really go into the process of transformation. Of course, in his case, more visible. But so there's when something is being transformed, structure is still preserved. So look, Shrikant, when he was 15, and Shrikant, he is now, he has transformed and changed, but somehow we think it is the same Shrikant. So A is A, and A is not A at the same time. And in the process of transformation, something is preserved. So when you read that section, you understand how the transformation takes place, and you can apply that same idea into other things. So that will be a really good concept for people to learn.
Wonderful. Sam, I wanted to clarify my comment about it's difficult. No, it's not difficult. It's easy in some sense. It's difficult in the sense that you will run into most people. Most people are not going to like, whenever you're working on, whenever you're going back to the core of your being and trying to work from there, most people are not going to like it because they are all about the periphery and the surface, and they're all about imitation. And they will just immediately spot, oh, you're not imitating, you're okay. But at the same time, this world is very large. Just like Louis Sullivan found and Christopher Alexander found, world is very large. And there are many, many, many people, huge number. And as we go along, it is harder for Louis Sullivan. It was easier for Christopher Alexander. Anybody in the future is going to be a lot easier of being able to find the people who can see. All you have to see is that, okay, do you want to live? That's it. If they want to live, then you have a client. It's like, do you want to be human? Right? That's all the question that these people are asking. So in that sense, it is easy. All you have to do is to find those people. And it's also not difficult in the sense that imagine yourself knowing what you know to be doing only imitation. It will actually kill you, because so in that sense, when to the extent to which you are pursuing, you are living in it already. No matter, so the scale of it, you can't control. Scale of what you will achieve, you cannot control, because that depends on many things, externalities. But to the extent to which you are pursuing it, to that extent, you are living. This is like equivalent of the Stoics of saying the dichotomy of control. You can control something, you can't control something. Thank you. So just wanted to clarify that. Next,
as Nietzsche said, that which doesn't kill you will make you stronger.
Yes, exactly. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. And that was a beautiful answer, Sam. The idea with the unfolding, because I thought immediately that's like the present moment. That's something that we all kind of understand that and I often think about, and just letting things be. One of the questions I have is, I read a little bit about Christopher Alexander, converting the unself-conscious to the self-conscious. and this idea of intention, I would think, behind that. So he also used that, he was using the principles of adaptation and differentiation when he was explaining that. And I was just wondering if you could actually go into a little bit more detail. I'm understanding that as him, being basically intentional with your actions. That's how I was thinking about it, but I don't know if that's a correct summary. Anyway.
When you say intentional, do you, like, I'm thinking about the philosophical concept of intentionality. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say it's so hard to explain. Like, I knew doing this presentation, it would be difficult you want to like go into so much detail on these ideas, but you end up just kind of touching on them. I think because maybe it was an overreaction on his part to what he saw as he was approaching things in an overly mathematical way, in terms of, when we look at a lot of vernacular buildings, they were sustainable because they had to be, which means that like so many factors, like using local materials, how they're adapted to their climate, are accounted for. But then and there is a lot of beauty and life to vernacular buildings, but it excludes also, like, the Gothic cathedrals. Say the Gothic cathedrals aren't purely adaptive, or like he talks about the Buddhist temples as well. And I think there's this kind of and this is something that one of his colleagues, Nikos Salangaros, kind of expands upon. You have the pattern language, which is the kind of more adaptive sense of architecture, and you also have the form language, which is these forms that you've inherited that are already adaptive. So like, I'm trying to think of one. If you know what a sprocket is on the side of a roof, it makes the kind of roof curve towards the end, but it also has a functional role to play, where it sheds rainwater off the building. And what Alexander finds more and more is that those things which they're not purely functional, the more beautiful they are, actually the more functional they are. And there's this correspondence between that. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So what I want to do now for the remaining time, it looks like the book that we have to start with is The Timeless Way of Building, because that's something that is, very close to what we have done. So it'll be a natural extension. So I want to ask both Sam and Yasuhiko to talk a little bit about that book, because then I'm going to use that in order to get people excited about reading the book and maybe discussing it together. So Sam, would you like to go first and talk about the book a little bit? Or Yasuhiko, go ahead, Sam.
Yasuhiko, do you want to go first? Because I was thinking I could just read.
I guess we'll try something here, so yes, please.
Okay, so folks, as they're, whenever you guys are ready, you can just start talking. Meanwhile, I always have things in my.
Sure we can. You're frozen if you can hear us.
Well, I'm sure maybe he'll be back in a minute.
And
there he is.
What's that? What happened?
You were frozen for about.
Oh, I was
30
frozen.
seconds.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me repeat what I said. So firstly, I want to say that this has been amazing. This has been an amazing discussion. I was very excited about discussing things with Sam and trying to compare Christopher Alexander and Louis Sullivan as an introduction. And I'm just delighted that Yasuhiko showed up, and it made the discussion so much richer than just the two of us would have been able to do. So I'm really grateful for Yasuhiko, and it's just delightful to be able to talk about these ideas. So tell me whenever you guys are ready, you can just start. Sam, are you ready?
Yeah, I was thinking a good idea would just be to read from the book.
Sure, go ahead.
I'll just read an extract.
Sure.
So one of the sections he talks about the kernel of the way. And he says, and yet the timeless way is not complete, and we will not fully generate the quality without a name until we leave the gate behind. Indeed, this ageless character has nothing in the end to do with languages. The language and the processes which stem from it merely release the fundamental order which is native to us. They do not teach us, they only remind us of what we know already, and of what we shall discover time and time again when we give up our ideas and opinions and do exactly what emerges from ourselves. So I know Alexander found, I think you read The Cloud of Unknowing, it's like written by a Christian saint. He kind of, it's almost like negative theology, his approach to this. Like we can't sort of pin it down, but we can sort of see ways of approaching it that are metaphorical.
Thank you, Sam. Yasuhiko.
The book is written in a very unique way. First of all, as I said, when I read this book for the first time, I said, this is the 20th century, now it is 21st century, it was 20th century Tao Te Ching. It has that flavor and that depth of wisdom and understanding of wholeness. And the book is written in an interesting way because it has one section, which contains the basic concept of all of it. And you can read in like less than 1 hour. And he actually said to people, if you don't have time, just read that section only. And then, today many questions have been asked, but all of the questions that are being asked is answered in this book. And just let me read the major part. The first part is called the quality. Then he talks about the quality without a name. And being alive, patterns of events, patterns of space, and so on and so forth. And second part is the gate, the flower and the seed, our pattern languages, the character, a creative pattern of language, breakdown of language, and so on and so forth. We talk about language. Then the last section is called the way. The genetic power of language, differentiating space, and so forth, all the way. So, although this is a book on architecture, profoundly philosophical. So it is a beautiful movement from all that we have been studying into some same area coming from a different perspective. And so one of the most beautiful books, just language itself is beautiful.
Wonderful.
In terms of writing, I think this is the best of his books. It's poetic.
What is the section that he recommends? That
No, he just has the first section has just only the major point without any explanations.
Perfect.
And then you can just read them, and then you get something out of it.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. All right. Thank you, Yasuhiko. So now, closing thoughts. Sam, what do you think? How did it go?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, we may have rushed through the presentation a bit, but I hope that we've given you that sort of thirst to read Alexander's work. And I think I found when I was reading him, and I've very rarely experienced this, that you take it in and you think, wow, this is like he's really getting at the heart of the matter here, and it feels almost like providential in a way to be reading it. So yeah, I hope some of you are inspired after this to dip into any of his work. And if you want to start small, like I said, just start with any of his essays, like A City is Not a Tree, and you'll see.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Yasuhiko, any closing thoughts?
I haven't read his thing, although I have them all in my bookcase, well over 15 years. And obviously, it left a tremendously deep impression, and is kind of alive. When I read books, I am more interested in how the author thinks. And it seems that I have absorbed his way of thinking. So that's why I remember many things. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to kind of rekindle my interest again in reading his books. And I'm sure I will learn much more this time if I continue to read. So Joe, I just wanted to add one more thing when we talk about geometry. I think Buckminster Fuller's architecture is basically already made. So dome in one place is the same dome in another place. And his architecture is completely merged with the landscape and location. So in that sense, to me, it is a more superior way of building because it becomes a part of nature and living geometry. So that's one thing I forgot to say. Yes. Anyway, thank you very much. I truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Sam, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly mention that, Shrikant, you were saying about how it might be difficult. There is a school set up to his legacy called Building Beauty. And if anyone's interested in software design as well, there's also a beautiful software initiative as well. So those are two things to check out.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Yasuhiko. This was Sam. This was just great. This was one of the best introductions we've had, because all of us kind of put together. We kind of connected it to what Louis Sullivan did. We connected to the Tao. We have a specific book that we can start looking at. There is a specific chapter that we can start off with to kind of dive into it. And the way we do this is that what we have found is actually learning together works really well. So my job now is to kind of get, and you guys have already done like 90% of the work, to actually get them excited about reading that first part because there is of that book, because there is nothing like actually going and reading the person himself. We can talk about it, but unless you actually commune with the words and exactly how he thinks, as Yasuhiko was pointing out, really what is being offered is how they think. That is the biggest value. And that's what you have to take in and see if it can add to who you are. So thank you very much, everybody. And thanks, great questions. And we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody. Bye.